On June 24, 1812, the French Emperor Napoleon led 450,000 men across the Niemen River into Russia, beginning one of the most notorious military disasters in history. Throughout this 6-month campaign, both French and Russian commanders would struggle with forces far greater than any army: politics, logistics, and of course, nature. In 1805 and 1806, Napoleon crushed the armies of Austria and Prussia, extending the French Empire over much of Western Europe. Part of his success came because the Russian army started far from the theater of war and could not reinforce the Germans in time. When Napoleon finally faced the Russians in 1807, the results were much less one-sided. Eylau was a draw fought in atrocious winter conditions, while at Friedland the Russians, while badly defeated, successfully withdrew back to the border. Nevertheless, the battles convinced the Russian Tsar Alexander to ask for peace. The resulting treaties of Tilsit carved up continental Europe between Napoleon and Alexander. France would dominate Central and Western Europe. Russia would have a free hand in the East. Both pledged to defend the new order against the overseas enemy, Great Britain, and accordingly, Russia joined France's continental system, under which it would stop all trade with Britain as a form of economic warfare. Despite this, neither side really accepted the other's hegemony. Alexander still expected Napoleon's empire to eventually collapse and had no interest in helping him solidify it. When Austria fought France again in 1809, the Tsar would only give token support. In turn, neither was Napoleon ready to grant Russian desires in either Poland or the Balkans. But the chief irritant in the relationship would be Alexander's increasing reluctance to abide by the continental system. As Britain was Russia's chief export market, the Tsar's embargo had done considerable damage to his own economy, which only added to the anti-Napoleonic sentiment amongst the Russian aristocracy. In late 1810, Alexander finally gave in and resumed trade with Britain under quote-unquote neutral shipping. Napoleon's response was to begin preparing for war, and when this failed to deter Alexander, finally committing to it in mid-1811, the stage was set for the Emperor's greatest challenge yet. This video is sponsored by Bloodlines, Heroes of Lethus. Bloodline Heroes of Lethus is a hero collector fantasy RPG with a 3D art style in which you can build your kingdom and collect champions to defend it and the world. But even better, you can create your unique legendary champions by combining the bloodlines of elves, demons, demigods, orcs, dwarves, lycans, dragonborn, and more. You can scan my QR code to play the game for free and participate in the Halloween event, get a free vampire champion on the 7th day, and receive a special starter pack worth $20. And if you haven't tried out Bloodline, now is the best time to get in because the game just got the biggest update ever. The newly added hybrid system is mind-blowing. You can customize your champions through their unique marriage system to create over 800 different new hybrids between any two bloodlines, not only inheriting their talents and traits but also their unique appearances, passed down from each family tree and merged into one. And new fantasy characters are being released into the game every month, which means that the possibilities are endless for you to seek out the best and the greatest hybrid champion to suit your style. The game is available on Android and iOS. Download and try out Bloodlines now for free using my link in the description or by scanning the QR code shown on screen. If you sign up during the next 30 days, you'll get a special starter pack worth $20, 10 energy potions, 100,000 gold, 100 diamonds, and a free vampire champion this Halloween, starting October 27th. Napoleon's goals were deceptively limited on the surface. He simply wanted Russia to rejoin his continental system. But that meant forcing the Tsar to accept a deeply unpopular policy. So Napoleon planned for a decisive campaign that would end Alexander's ability to resist him. Achieving such an outcome in the vast expanse of Russia would be a formidable task. Seeking inspiration from history, Napoleon studied the records of the last great invasion of Russia, led by Sweden's Charles XII from 1707 to 1709. Charles initially invaded Poland with 44,000 battle-hardened Swedes, hoping to destroy Russia's main army there. At the time, Sweden was known for mounting rapid, long-distance strikes that were sustained by its army living off the land as it went. In this way, Charles hoped to outmaneuver, trap, and destroy the Russians. Instead, the Russians repeatedly withdrew ahead of Swedish maneuvers, scorching the earth in their wake to deny forage to the Swedes. After months of this, the Swedes were lured deep into modern Belarus, their numbers halved by starvation, disease, and the need to garrison captured territory. Charles had hoped to aim for Russia's capital, Moscow, where Russia's army would surely have had to confront him. But now he was forced to abandon the chase, call in reinforcements, and focus on finding supplies. And that was when the Russians struck. They scattered Charles's reinforcements, harassed his army, and lured the Swedes even further into modern Ukraine. At Poltava, Charles's force was finally confronted by a Russian force twice its size, and the result was Swedish annihilation. Charles's misadventure taught Napoleon several things. First, Napoleon largely followed the Swedish invasion route through Belarus, which isn't surprising considering the sparse infrastructure there. And although Moscow was no longer Russia's capital by 1812, it was still of immense spiritual importance, and its central position would allow for additional options towards Russia's actual capital of St. Petersburg, or its breadbasket of Ukraine. Second, Napoleon agreed with Charles that the Russian army was key to the Tsar's resistance, and its destruction would win the war. But as shown, the Russians were unlikely to fall for Napoleon's preferred tactics of outmaneuver and entrapment, which would give the French an easy win on the cheap. Brute frontal assaults might well be needed to get the Russians to fight. Third, given the high possibility that the Russians would lure him deep into their territory, Napoleon needed an army that would absorb the inevitable attrition, provide detachments to hold the flanks, and still be large enough to fight a battle under reasonable odds. Accordingly, the Emperor increased the draft, diluted the officer ranks, and called on his German, Italian, and Polish allies to provide troops. The result was a 600,000-strong Grande Armée, the largest Napoleon had ever led, even if its quality left much to be desired, especially in the infantry arm. And finally, fourth, a supply system was needed to invade Russia, especially for an army of this size. But by 1812, the French had long since ditched the pre-revolution supply system, replacing it with extensive foraging as the army went. Like Sweden a century before, forage gave French armies extensive reach and speed, demonstrated in 1809 when tens of thousands smoothly redeployed from Spain to Austria. But Russia was far less densely populated than Western Europe. In particular, the expected theater of war, modern Lithuania and Belarus, only had about 1 million people in an area slightly smaller than modern France. Even without the inevitable Russian scorched earth tactics, the local region clearly couldn't sustain an army numbering half its population. Napoleon therefore returned to the pre-revolution supply system. He assembled thousands of wagons, barges, and animals, grouped into 26 transport battalions. Some would establish depots in the army's rear. Others would travel from these depots to troops on the front line. In this way, Napoleon hoped to maintain a reasonable supply level as he advanced. In hindsight, some of these preparations were insufficient. The wagons were not designed for Russia's often muddy roads, and only the worst soldiers were assigned to this low-prestige work. But more importantly, Napoleon failed to adjust his operational method to the new logistics reality. Pre-revolution generals limited themselves to slow, methodical, limited campaigns because they knew how unreliable their supply systems could be. By contrast, Napoleon still hoped to conduct post-revolution, aggressive, long-distance maneuvers. For all his preparations for an extensive invasion of Russia, Napoleon's ideal campaign remained one where the enemy fully cooperated with him, either by attacking Poland or staying near the border. Either would allow the French to trap and annihilate them in a month, and that outcome wasn't entirely unlikely, given what he knew of Russian strategy. Napoleon had advertised his war preparation in the hope of scaring Tsar Alexander, so the Russians had ample time to design their response. Since late 1810, the Russians were already disengaging from border wars, realigning with Britain, and subverting French hegemony in Germany. These initiatives bore fruit just before the invasion, as Russia made peace with Turkey, allied with Sweden and Britain, and got Austria to limit its contribution to the upcoming war. Reforms since 1805 had increased the effectiveness of Russian artillery and infantry, while its light and irregular Cossack cavalry were already the best in Europe. Mobilization efforts by 1812 yielded a 600,000-man army, including reserves, backed up by 1 million militia of varying quality. But the Russians lacked trained engineers to support a defense, and were further hampered by an inefficient command system, ridden by mutual suspicion, not just between the generals, but also between them and the Tsar. There were also broader constraints on Russian strategy. Russia's economy was in terrible shape, which the continental system only exacerbated. It could only get by through printing money, which caused its currency to depreciate by half over a decade. Even accounting for British subsidies and the low cost of Russian soldiers, the country couldn't maintain extensive mobilization for long. Added to this was the weak political position of Tsar Alexander. His father had been overthrown in a coup in 1801, and the British believed that they could do the same to him by destroying the Russian fleet. Napoleon certainly believed that capturing Moscow would force his surrender, and even Russian generals during the invasion felt entitled to demand the Tsar change ministers. As a result, the traditional Russian strategy was long-ranging offensive campaigns, which would both allow the Russian army to live off the enemy and fit with the cult of the offensive that characterized Russian military honor at the time. By contrast, letting the enemy spoil Russian lands was seen as an absolute humiliation. Up until 1812, Russia thought of striking the French in Poland first, with the help of a defecting Prussia. But as the true scale of Napoleon's army became known, though as a state secret it was known only to the Tsar, his war minister de Tolly, and their staff, it became clear that such an attack would play into Napoleon's hands. The Emperor wanted a quick, decisive campaign. Everybody else, Prussian defectors, anti-Napoleon spies, and de Tolly, urged the Tsar to put up an extended defense. De Tolly drew up a strategy for Russian armies to withdraw past Belarus and Lithuania. They would take up new positions at forts before the borders of Russia proper, marked by the upper reaches of the Dvina and Dnieper rivers. The Grande Armée would be forced to march across and lay siege within poorly supplied territory, bleeding it dry and opening the way for a Russian counteroffensive. Until that point, nobody was to fight Napoleon and run the risk of destruction. This strategy was politically risky. Both de Tolly and the Tsar were already under suspicion for their prior alignment with France, Napoleonic-style reforms, and extensive use of ethnic non-Russians. So as war loomed, the Tsar began to emphasize his Russian credentials. Letting Napoleon march to Russia itself was one part of this. Alexander also replaced reformers with Russian conservatives and made emotional pleas to the church and nobility. His efforts worked. While many aristocrats remained wary of the Tsar's government, they enthusiastically teamed up with Russian merchants to donate money, goods, and serfs to the war effort, eager to defend the motherland against whom the Orthodox Church deemed an antichrist. Even then, significant risks remained. Russian generals could still place military honor before de Tolly's strategy. Large sections of the Dvina-Dnieper line weren't and couldn't be fortified due to a lack of engineers, with the most the Russians had being fortified camps. And lastly, the Russians also needed Napoleon to cooperate. Should the Emperor limit his appetite to merely advancing the borders of his Polish ally, then the Tsar would have simply given away territory for nothing. Here, the Russians could only hope that Napoleon's ambition would override his military sense. Even as the French gathered in East Prussia and Poland, they were already in logistical trouble. Wishing to preserve his rations and extend his campaign time, Napoleon had told the army to forage until the invasion began. But there wasn't enough to feed 600,000 men. And soon, dysentery and typhus outbreaks further added to the soldiers' misery. Nevertheless, by June 1812, Napoleon's Grande Armée had formed into three main groups. The Central Army, about 450,000 strong, a mostly Prussian corps guarding its northern flank, and a mostly Austrian corps further to the south. On the other side, the Russians were still repositioning their armies. Against France's northern corps stood the fortress of Riga, soon to be reinforced by the army of Finland, now freed from observing Sweden. Against the southern corps was the newly formed Third Army in western Ukraine, soon to be reinforced by the Danube Army, returning from the Turkish War. And finally, against Napoleon himself were two armies. First Army with 125,000 men in Lithuania under de Tolly himself, and Second Army with 50,000 in western Belarus under Bagration. The Grande Armée invaded Russia on June 24th, invading Lithuania in the hopes of trapping First Army around Vilnius. But almost immediately, supply problems began to slow the French offensive. Heavy rains and muddy roads trapped soldiers and wagons, and the French rear gradually fell behind. To avoid being dangerously strung out on the march, Napoleon had little choice but to order his vanguard to slow down the pursuit. In any case, de Tolly was already withdrawing First Army to the Dvina, specifically the fortified camp of Griess in northern Belarus. Originally, he had hoped to use Bagration's Second Army to strike at Napoleon's rear in Poland, but by now it was clear that the enemy was too large for that. Second Army was therefore asked to pull back and join First Army, but Bagration, who was not informed of the Grande Armée's true size, protested, and only an order from the Tsar could get him to move. In the meantime, Napoleon had slipped a 70,000 corps under Davout in between the two Russian armies. Now 1 week into the invasion in early July, Napoleon decided to switch targets to Bagration instead. He ordered the corps directly facing Bagration, led by his brother Jerome, to pin Second Army down, while Davout maneuvered into its rear. It was soon obvious that Jerome, due to supply or incompetence, was failing to do this. But rather than personally supervise the action, the Emperor hatched a scheme to have Davout usurp Jerome's command. An angry Jerome quit the war, his corps ground to a halt, and Second Army escaped yet another French maneuver, though Davout continued to block its path towards First Army as both forces moved across Belarus. Meanwhile, de Tolly had uneventfully withdrawn to Griess, only to discover that the camp was utterly unsuitable as a place to wait out Napoleon. By mid-July, de Tolly decided to withdraw again, just in time to foil Napoleon's latest maneuver to entrap First Army. The Russians proceeded to Vitebsk in northeast Belarus, with the French shadowing them from the other side of the Dvina. The city basically marked the limit of de Tolly's Dvina-Dnieper line, and so at the end of July, First Army turned to make a stand here, hoping that Second Army would finally be able to join them. This was the decisive battle that Napoleon had been waiting for, and accordingly, his vanguard began skirmishing with the Russians as the Emperor brought up the rest of the army for action. It was not to be. Frustratingly, this time Napoleon was undone by Davout's actions further south, which had again blocked Bagration from moving north. As soon as de Tolly heard this, First Army immediately resumed its withdrawal to Smolensk on the Russian border. By now, the French had crossed the entirety of Lithuania and Belarus without much result. so the Emperor called a halt to operations in order to rest, reorganize, and take stock of events. If you stayed around this far, thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment as a sacrifice to the algorithm. You can also support us on Patreon and get ad-free early access to our videos for as little as $1, or by clicking the thanks button below to leave a one-time tip. As always, we'll see you in the next one.